"Your badge doesn't work, sir. The executive floor is reserved for board members only." The words echoed across the polished marble lobby just loudly enough for nearby executives to pause without appearing obvious, and for a heartbeat the entire entrance to Hawthorne Global Headquarters seemed to hold its breath. Marcus Ellison looked down at the badge hanging neatly from his navy suit, then back at the young receptionist whose smile had already faded into practiced indifference. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded once as though the inconvenience belonged to someone else. Around him, tailored suits flowed toward the private elevators carrying the company's most influential leaders to the annual board summit, the one meeting that would determine the future of a corporation worth nearly $30 billion. A digital screen welcomed every executive by name as they arrived. Richard Collins, Evelyn Brooks, Thomas Grant, Margaret Lawson. One after another, names illuminated the display before fading away. Marcus waited without expression. His name never appeared. Behind the reception desk, Richard Collins approached with the confidence of a man who believed authority naturally belonged to him. His silver tie caught the morning light as he glanced briefly at Marcus before looking back toward the elevators. "Looks like someone forgot to update your access," Richard said with an almost sympathetic smile that never reached his eyes. "Only executives cleared by the board can attend today." Several nearby directors exchanged quiet glances. One of them recognized Marcus from somewhere but couldn't quite place him. Another assumed he must be an outside consultant. No one asked questions. In corporate America, silence often traveled faster than truth. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. "I understand," he replied calmly. His voice carried no frustration, no embarrassment, only the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime learning that dignity never required volume. Richard gave a satisfied nod before stepping toward the elevator reserved exclusively for board members. "Security will help if you need directions to the guest conference rooms," he added over his shoulder. The elevator doors closed. The executives disappeared upstairs. Marcus remained exactly where he was. Across the lobby, a junior administrative assistant named Emily Parker watched the exchange while organizing registration folders. She frowned for only a second before returning to her work. Something about the scene felt wrong, though she couldn't explain why. Marcus slowly walked toward the expansive windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Morning sunlight reflected across the skyline, turning the glass towers into mirrors. He had admired that view countless times over the years, long before many of the people upstairs had ever occupied an executive office. 23 years earlier, he had stood in another corporate lobby wearing a borrowed suit after graduating business school. A hiring manager had glanced at his resume, then at his face, and quietly suggested he might be more comfortable applying for a support role instead of management. Marcus remembered thanking the man before walking out without another word. That afternoon he promised himself something simple. He would never spend his career convincing people he belonged. He would build something so valuable that one day the room would need him more than he needed the room. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. His phone vibrated once. A calendar reminder flashed across the screen. Board strategy session. 9 a.m. Marcus dismissed the notification without reacting. Nearby, executives continued checking in, chatting about quarterly earnings, acquisitions, and shareholder expectations. More than one person glanced curiously toward the quiet black man standing alone by the windows, but no one stopped to ask why he had not gone upstairs. Marcus checked the time. 8:56. 4 minutes before the meeting. He slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket, adjusted his cufflinks, and continued waiting with remarkable patience, while several floors above, an entire boardroom prepared to begin the most important meeting of the year without realizing they had already left behind the only person who could truly make it begin. Marcus Ellison remained near the floor-to-ceiling windows as the private elevator carried the board members out of sight. The lobby slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Receptionists answered phones. Visitors signed in. Couriers crossed the polished floor with overnight packages. To everyone passing through, he appeared to be a patient executive waiting for a delayed meeting. That assumption suited him perfectly. He glanced once toward the digital clock above the reception desk. 8:58. 2 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. Emily Parker continued organizing registration folders, but her attention kept drifting toward Marcus. She quietly opened the printed executive attendance list one more time. Richard Collins had personally approved every name before sunrise. She noticed something unusual. The list skipped from the letter E directly to G. There was no section for names beginning with the letter F. It looked less like an accident and more like a document that had been revised too many times. Emily hesitated, then closed the folder as Richard stepped back into the lobby to answer a phone call. His voice carried the confidence of someone convinced the morning was unfolding exactly as planned. "Yes, we have full attendance," he said. "The meeting will begin on schedule." He ended the call, glanced briefly toward Marcus again, and walked away without another word. Marcus never acknowledged him. Instead, he watched the reflection of the city skyline shimmer across the glass. The view reminded him that buildings always looked strongest from a distance. Only the people responsible for maintaining them knew which beams carried the real weight. His phone remained silent. No messages. No requests. No urgency. That silence meant more than any notification could have. Upstairs, the boardroom doors closed precisely at 9 o'clock. Inside, directors greeted one another with polished smiles and familiar conversation. Financial reports rested neatly beside tablets. Coffee cups steamed quietly along the conference table. Richard welcomed everyone before introducing the agenda for what he called a defining day for the company's future. The presentation screens illuminated. Charts appeared. Forecasts loaded. Everything looked flawless. Downstairs, Marcus calmly adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. He had attended enough meetings over 2 decades to recognize that appearances often created the greatest illusions. Companies rarely stumbled because of dramatic mistakes. More often, they overlooked one quiet detail until every carefully built plan depended on it. Emily finally gathered enough courage to approach him. "Sir," she said softly, "I feel like something is not right. I checked the registration list twice." Marcus offered a polite smile. Sometimes the most interesting answers appear after everyone believes the questions are finished. She looked at him with growing curiosity. There was no frustration in his voice. No resentment. Only complete certainty. Before she could respond, one of the reception monitors briefly flashed a system notification before disappearing again. Emily barely caught the message, but 2 words remained in her memory. Authorization pending. She frowned. The same message had never appeared during previous board meetings. Marcus noticed her expression but said nothing. Across the lobby, employees continued their routines without realizing that only a few floors above them, an executive meeting that had begun with complete confidence was quietly approaching its first unexpected obstacle. Upstairs, confidence still filled the boardroom. Richard Collins stood beside the massive presentation screen with the relaxed posture of someone who believed every variable had already been controlled. The quarterly forecasts drew approving nods from directors around the polished walnut table as financial analysts distributed updated reports. Everything appeared perfectly organized until the first resolution reached the voting stage. The corporate secretary pressed the authorization button on her tablet. A soft chime sounded through the room before the screen displayed a simple message in blue letters. Executive authorization pending. She frowned and pressed the button again. The same message returned. Richard smiled politely. "Probably just a synchronization delay," he said. "Give the system a minute." The room remained calm. Minor technical issues were hardly unusual during large meetings. The secretary refreshed her tablet, while another administrator checked the meeting server. A third attempt produced the identical message. Executive authorization pending. This time several board members exchanged uncertain glances. Richard walked toward the technology console and asked one of the information technology specialists to investigate. Within moments, another screen displayed a list of system checkpoints. Every item showed green except the final authorization gateway, which remained locked. "Can we bypass it?" Richard asked. The specialist shook his head. "No, sir. This approval layer was intentionally designed so that it cannot be overridden from inside the meeting." Richard folded his arms. "Who designed that feature?" The specialist scrolled through archived documentation before answering quietly. "It has been part of the governance platform for several years." The answer felt strangely incomplete, yet nobody pressed further. Downstairs, Marcus Ellison remained exactly where he had been, watching the flow of employees entering and leaving the lobby. Emily Parker approached again carrying a fresh stack of visitor folders, though it was obvious she had invented the task simply to pass nearby. "The board meeting should have started by now," she said carefully. Marcus nodded once. "It did. You seem very certain about what is happening upstairs." Marcus looked toward the elevator doors. "Meetings usually reveal themselves long before anyone opens the minutes." Emily studied his calm expression. There was no satisfaction in it. No hint that he expected anyone to fail. Only patience. At 9:14, the private elevator doors opened unexpectedly. One of the information technology managers hurried across the lobby while speaking into a headset. He barely noticed Marcus standing nearby. "No, restarting the authorization server will not solve it," he said. "The system is waiting for a credential that has not been verified." He disappeared into another hallway before Emily could ask any questions. She looked back toward Marcus, whose attention remained fixed on the city skyline beyond the glass. 20 years earlier he had learned that the strongest systems were not built to reward power. They were built to prevent it from being abused. That lesson had shaped every safeguard he had quietly introduced into the company's governance structure. Upstairs, impatience slowly replaced confidence. Directors who had expected a quick approval process now checked their watches. Coffee cups cooled untouched beside carefully prepared reports. Richard requested another status update. The technology specialist hesitated before answering. "We have confirmed the platform is operating normally. The system is not malfunctioning. It is waiting exactly as it was programmed to wait." The room fell noticeably quieter as the meaning of those words settled over the table. The atmosphere inside the boardroom shifted almost without anyone noticing. It was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no sudden alarms, only the slow realization that every carefully prepared agenda item had reached the same invisible wall. The chief financial officer attempted to approve the first acquisition package again. The legal counsel submitted the compliance documents through a separate terminal. The corporate secretary even tried opening the files from a backup workstation. Every attempt ended with the same quiet response across every screen. "Executive authorization pending." Richard Collins paced beside the conference table with measured confidence that was beginning to look rehearsed. "There has to be another administrative pathway," he insisted. No company would allow one approval checkpoint to delay an entire board meeting. The information technology director looked uncomfortable before answering. "Normally there would not be, sir. This safeguard was intentionally designed to prevent any single executive from bypassing governance procedures." Richard frowned. "Then call whoever built it." The director exchanged a glance with the general counsel before opening an archived project database. Hundreds of engineering records appeared on the display. Design revisions. Security audits. Governance updates. Finally, one document opened near the top of the list. Governance Authorization Framework. Lead executive sponsor, Marcus Ellison. The room became noticeably quieter. Richard leaned closer to the screen. Scroll further. The document explained that all strategic approvals above a specified financial threshold required a verified executive credential that could not be substituted or delegated during active board proceedings. The safeguard had been unanimously approved years earlier after Marcus proposed stronger accountability measures to protect shareholders and prevent unauthorized commitments. Several directors slowly remembered that meeting. At the time, they had praised the framework as one of the strongest corporate governance systems in the industry. None of them had imagined they would someday be sitting inside a room unable to proceed because the very safeguard they applauded was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Downstairs, Marcus remained near the lobby windows, calmly watching morning traffic move through downtown Chicago. Emily Parker returned carrying a tablet instead of paperwork. "People upstairs are calling every department," she said quietly. "No one seems to know why nothing is moving." Marcus smiled politely. "Sometimes the strongest system is the one people never notice until they need it." Emily studied him more carefully than before. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture still seemed impossible. She remembered seeing his name attached to archived orientation materials during her first week with the company. At the time, she assumed he had retired years ago. She never imagined he would be standing only a few feet away. Her tablet vibrated with another internal message requesting any available records related to executive authorization credentials. She looked at Marcus, then at the elevator doors, then back at the message. Upstairs, directors who had arrived expecting routine approvals were now reviewing company bylaws instead of quarterly forecasts. The general counsel finally closed one of the legal binders and spoke with unusual caution. "This framework cannot be overridden during a live board session without violating the governance policy adopted by this board." Richard folded his arms. "Then who holds the credential the system is requesting?" The general counsel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the archived document bearing a familiar signature before quietly saying, "The authorization belongs to Marcus Ellison, and according to every record we have, the meeting cannot legally advance until he is present." Silence settled over the boardroom with a weight that no presentation could overcome. The words from the general counsel lingered in the air long after he finished speaking. Every executive around the table looked from one screen to another as though expecting the system to suddenly change its mind. It never did. The message remained exactly the same. Executive authorization pending. Richard Collins forced a confident smile, but it no longer carried the certainty it had only minutes earlier. "Locate Marcus Ellison immediately," he said. "He must still be somewhere in the building." The corporate secretary opened the executive attendance system, expecting to find his location through the standard access records. Instead, another surprise appeared. There was no record showing that Marcus had entered the executive floor because his badge had never been activated. The only verified entry placed him in the main lobby. Several directors exchanged puzzled looks. One of them leaned forward and asked the obvious question. "If he is required for this meeting, why was he never brought upstairs?" No one answered. Every pair of eyes slowly turned toward Richard. Downstairs, Marcus remained remarkably composed. He accepted a cup of coffee from the cafe near the reception area, thanked the barista with genuine kindness, and sat in a quiet seating area overlooking the lobby. He looked less like a frustrated executive and more like someone enjoying a rare peaceful morning before a busy day. Emily watched from behind the reception desk with growing curiosity. Her internal messaging application suddenly filled with urgent requests from departments she had never heard from before. The legal office wanted confirmation that Marcus had checked into the building. Information technology requested his badge identification number. Corporate administration wanted to know whether anyone had spoken with him that morning. Emily realized she was one of the very few people who actually knew where he was. Before she could respond, the general counsel himself stepped out of the private elevator. His pace was brisk, but his expression remained carefully professional. He approached the reception desk first. "Emily, have you seen Mr. Marcus Ellison this morning?" She quietly pointed toward the seating area beside the windows. The attorney followed her gaze and immediately recognized Marcus. His posture changed almost instantly. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his tie, and walked across the lobby with visible respect. Marcus looked up from his coffee as the attorney approached. Good morning, Daniel, he said warmly. I hope the meeting started on time. Daniel offered a polite smile that carried a hint of embarrassment. Technically, yes. Practically, no. Marcus nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer. I see. Daniel lowered his voice. The board has discovered that the governance authorization framework requires your executive approval before any official action can proceed. They would appreciate your presence upstairs. Marcus remained seated for another quiet moment before setting his coffee cup onto the table. He looked through the glass toward the Chicago skyline, where sunlight reflected across neighboring buildings. Interesting, he said calmly. This morning I was informed that the executive floor was reserved for board members only. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly before replying. That misunderstanding is being addressed. Marcus stood, buttoned his jacket, and picked up his leather portfolio. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction, and certainly no desire to embarrass anyone. He simply carried himself with the steady confidence of someone who had never doubted where he belonged. As they walked toward the private elevator together, employees across the lobby quietly watched without fully understanding why one calm executive had suddenly become the most important person in the entire building. The private elevator climbed in complete silence. Marcus Ellison stood beside Daniel, the general counsel, with the same calm expression he had worn all morning. Neither man felt the need to fill the quiet with unnecessary conversation. Every floor they passed represented another level of responsibility, another reminder that leadership was measured by decisions made under pressure rather than by titles printed on office doors. When the elevator finally opened, the atmosphere outside the boardroom felt noticeably different from the confidence that had filled it less than an hour earlier. Administrative assistants moved quickly between offices carrying updated documents. Information technology specialists stood near conference terminals reviewing system logs one final time. Conversation stopped the moment Marcus stepped into the hallway. Several employees who had walked past him in the lobby without a second glance now nodded respectfully as he passed. Daniel opened the boardroom doors. Every head turned at once. Richard Collins immediately stood from his chair, his confident posture replaced by visible uncertainty. No one spoke for several long seconds. Marcus entered the room without rushing, placed his leather portfolio neatly on the conference table, and greeted the directors with the same professional courtesy he had shown throughout the morning. Good morning, everyone, he said evenly. I understand there has been a delay. The chairwoman of the board rose first. Marcus, thank you for coming. We appreciate your time. Marcus acknowledged her with a polite nod before looking around the room. Financial reports remained scattered across the table exactly where they had been left during repeated attempts to move forward. Coffee had gone cold. Presentation screens still displayed the familiar message requesting executive authorization. The entire meeting had been waiting for one person without realizing it until the system quietly revealed the truth. Richard cleared his throat. There appears to have been an administrative mistake with the executive access list this morning. Marcus met his eyes without anger or satisfaction. I was informed that only authorized executives could attend today's meeting, he replied calmly. The room became silent again. Nobody challenged the statement because everyone knew it was accurate. Daniel opened a governance binder and addressed the board. For the record, the authorization framework adopted by unanimous vote requires Mr. Ellison's verified executive credential before any strategic resolutions exceeding the established financial threshold may proceed. The system has functioned exactly as designed. Several directors slowly nodded as memories returned. They remembered the lengthy discussions years earlier when Marcus had insisted that no individual, regardless of position, should ever be able to bypass accountability. At the time, the safeguard had been praised as visionary. Today it had protected the company from proceeding without the required oversight. Marcus calmly activated his secure credential on the conference terminal. The blue notification disappeared. Within seconds, every pending agenda item changed from waiting status to ready for review. No dramatic sound filled the room. No celebration followed. The only difference was that the meeting could finally begin. Yet everyone understood what had truly happened. The authority that unlocked the company's future had never depended on who spoke the loudest or occupied the center seat. It had depended on the quiet leader whose work had become so deeply woven into the organization that his absence brought every important decision to a complete stop. The room remained unusually quiet even after the authorization system unlocked. No one reached for the next agenda item. No one hurried to resume the presentation. The brief delay had changed something far more important than the meeting schedule. It had changed the way every person in the room understood the company they believed they knew. Marcus Ellison calmly took his seat without displaying the slightest hint of triumph. He opened his leather portfolio, reviewed the first document waiting for approval, and placed it neatly on the table. The chairwoman looked around the room before speaking. Before we continue with today's agenda, there is one matter that deserves immediate clarification. Every director understood exactly what she meant. Richard Collins shifted slightly in his chair. His earlier confidence had disappeared, replaced by the realization that several board members were now studying him instead of the financial reports. The chairwoman continued in a measured tone. Mr. Ellison, our records confirm that your executive credential is essential to every strategic authorization under the governance framework. They also confirm that your name was omitted from the executive attendance list distributed this morning. Can you confirm whether you received an invitation? Marcus looked at the printed folder resting beside him. I received the same calendar invitation as every other board member several weeks ago, he answered calmly. When I arrived this morning, I was informed that my access was not available and that the executive floor was reserved for authorized attendees. I accepted the information exactly as it was presented. No accusation appeared in his voice. He simply described the events as facts. That made the silence afterward even heavier. Daniel, the general counsel, opened the attendance log on the large display. Our review indicates that the original invitation list included Mr. Ellison. A revised version was distributed yesterday evening. Another screen appeared beside it, showing the document history. Several revisions had been recorded. The final change removed a single executive name before distribution. Every timestamp pointed toward one approval account. Richard slowly looked down at the table. One director leaned forward. Was this modification requested by the board? Daniel answered without hesitation. No. There is no board authorization associated with this revision. Another director asked quietly, then who approved it? Daniel touched the screen once more. The approval history appeared beside the attendance record. The account responsible for the final revision belonged to Richard Collins. No one spoke for several seconds. The chairwoman closed the folder in front of her and folded her hands. The board expects every executive process to reflect the same standards of accountability that govern our business decisions. We will review this administrative action separately after today's meeting. Marcus simply nodded once. That sounds appropriate. He neither celebrated nor criticized the decision. Instead, he turned to the first strategic proposal waiting for discussion. Shall we begin? Our shareholders expect progress, and they have already waited long enough. The directors quietly straightened their documents. For the first time that morning, the meeting finally began with complete clarity. The most influential person in the room had not established authority through volume or status. He had earned it through years of careful leadership, thoughtful systems, and the quiet discipline to let integrity speak before he ever needed to. The remainder of the board meeting moved with a level of focus that had been absent all morning. Every proposal was reviewed carefully, every question received thoughtful discussion, and every decision followed the governance process Marcus Ellison had spent years refining. The atmosphere was no longer driven by assumptions. It was guided by accountability. As the final strategic resolution received unanimous approval, the chairwoman closed her folder and looked around the table. Before we adjourn, there is one final matter that requires immediate attention. Her voice remained calm, yet every director understood the importance of what would follow. Daniel, the general counsel, distributed a brief summary prepared during the meeting. It outlined the documented changes made to the executive attendance list, the resulting operational delay, and the governance implications of excluding a required executive from official proceedings. The report contained no emotional language. It simply presented verified facts supported by system records and timestamps. One director adjusted his glasses before speaking. Our governance standards exist to protect the company, not individual preferences. If those standards can be ignored for personal reasons, every shareholder is placed at unnecessary risk. Another director nodded in agreement. This is no longer about a meeting invitation. It is about confidence in executive judgment. Richard Collins remained silent. For the first time since the morning began, he seemed to recognize that influence could disappear much faster than it was earned. The chairwoman addressed him directly. Pending a formal review by the Governance and Ethics Committee, your administrative authority over executive access, meeting coordination, and governance scheduling will be suspended effective immediately. The decision was presented without anger or humiliation. It reflected the same procedural discipline expected throughout the organization. Richard slowly acknowledged the decision with a quiet nod. He understood that arguing against the process would only reinforce the very concerns now before the board. Marcus remained composed throughout the discussion. He neither encouraged the action nor commented on it. His attention stayed on the company's future rather than the mistakes of the morning. Several directors noticed that restraint. One quietly remarked, "The strongest leaders protect the institution before they protect themselves." As executives gathered their materials, conversations shifted away from the disruption and toward the lessons it revealed. Governance was not merely a collection of policies stored in digital manuals. It depended on people willing to respect those policies even when they became inconvenient. Marcus collected his portfolio and prepared to leave the boardroom. Before he reached the door, the chairwoman called his name. "Marcus." He turned politely. "Thank you for designing systems that protected this company even when they created temporary discomfort for those of us in this room." Marcus offered a small, sincere smile. "Good governance should never depend on personalities," he replied. "It should continue working even when people make imperfect decisions." The directors quietly reflected on those words as he left the boardroom. Outside, employees continued their normal routines, unaware that one ordinary morning had permanently reshaped the board's understanding of leadership. Titles could open doors, but character determined whether an organization continued moving forward when those doors unexpectedly closed. The following Monday morning, Hawthorne Global Headquarters looked exactly as it always had. Employees hurried through the revolving doors carrying laptops and coffee cups. Elevators filled with conversations about quarterly goals and client meetings. From the outside, nothing suggested that the previous week's board meeting had become one of the most discussed moments in the company's recent history. Yet inside the organization, something had quietly changed. The Governance and Ethics Committee released a series of procedural updates designed to strengthen executive oversight and ensure that no individual could alter official board records without transparent review. The changes were accepted unanimously. Managers across every department received additional training emphasizing that leadership was measured by fairness, consistency, and respect for established processes rather than personal influence. Emily Parker found herself reflecting on the events of that remarkable morning as she welcomed visitors at the reception desk. She no longer viewed the lobby as merely an entrance to the building. It had become a reminder that first impressions often revealed more about the observer than the person being observed. Late that afternoon, Marcus Ellison walked through the lobby once again. This time, employees greeted him naturally, not because of what had happened in the boardroom, but because they had come to understand the quiet example he set every day. Emily smiled as he approached. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ellison." Marcus returned the greeting warmly. "Good afternoon, Emily. I hope your week has been less eventful than the last one." She laughed softly before asking the question that had remained on her mind. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus nodded. "Of course. When you realized you had been left off the executive list, why did you stay so calm?" most people would have argued. Marcus paused for a moment before answering. Because arguments rarely change character. Systems do. If the truth is real, it eventually finds its own voice. Emily considered those words carefully. They carried none of the bitterness she might have expected after everything that had happened. Instead, they reflected the confidence of someone who understood that lasting respect could never be demanded. It had to be earned through steady actions repeated over many years. Before leaving, Marcus looked once across the busy lobby where employees from every department worked side by side toward shared goals. Companies grow because of people, he said quietly. The strongest organizations never depend on one personality. They depend on principles that outlast every title. As he stepped toward the exit, sunlight filled the glass entrance and reflected across the polished floor, just as it had on the morning when his name had been missing from a list that everyone assumed defined authority. In the end, the list had not determined who mattered. Character had. Quiet preparation had. Integrity had. The board meeting had revealed a lesson no annual report could measure. Real leadership does not need to announce itself, demand attention, or compete for recognition. It becomes visible when everything else stops moving without it. Marcus never raised his voice to prove his place. He simply continued living the standard he had spent years building, and in doing so reminded everyone around him that the greatest leaders are remembered not because they seek importance, but because their integrity quietly becomes the foundation on which everyone else depends.